So far, most of the articles that I've written have been in relation to the spiritual and how its psychology evolved over time. There have been some references to nature and geology, but here I will talk about how nature its very self has changed. It may seem peculiar to talk about it as a whole, as one thing, yet it does need exploring, for flora and fauna have significantly changed over the millions of years since our wee planet came to be. The main change I think that is significant is the transition from incredibly fierce creatures into smaller animals in the sea and on land. As Darwin explained, the majority fight for survival, yet why is there a huge disparity in the type of nature, especially when it comes to species? Obvious answers lead to changes in atmosphere, whether oxygen-rich or otherwise, but I believe that it's something more than this. First though, I need to explain something that we constantly forget. During the COVID pandemic, someone where I worked asked how anything like the illness ever came about. Surely God wouldn't create something so malign. My answer was this, that you cannot have free will for some things and not others, so essentially everything in existence has free will. Whether bacteria, plant or rock, gases, atoms or anything else, everything has free will. Hence, the COVID disease has the same degree of freedom to choose how to adapt and survive as anything else. The answer surprised them, but it got the point across. With this in mind, we can now look at the transition from megafauna and megaflora to something smaller. When animated life began on our planet, there were some pretty weird-looking creatures in the water and emerging to the land. Over lengthy periods of time we eventually had creatures like Titanoboa, estimated to have grown to 42 or 47 feet long, and weigh approximately 1,610 to 2,500 pounds. It was a huge creature. This is one example of many huge beings at this time, that lived during the Middle and Late Paleocene epoch. Others included Carbonemes, a giant turtle, as well as two behemoth-sized crocodile-like beasts, Cheirogonisuchus and a Chirontisichus. Have a look into these creatures. They're impressive, huge as well as pretty ferocious. At this time, it was quite literally a battle for survival, eat or be eaten. Further down the line though, we have typical dinosaurs and eventually smaller fauna. So the question in my mind is, why did the survival instinct decrease, allowing smaller creatures to come into being? And the answer is, abundance. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Yet the simple aspect took millennia to occur. 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago, the Great Oxidation Event, GO, occurred. Guess what happened? Lol. Further to this, two other events happened. The Neoproterozoic Oxygenation Event between 850 to 550 million years ago, and the Carboniferous Period 350 million years ago. When levels of gases in the atmosphere created the conditions for life, being more oxygen-rich, it sustained a greater variety of flora and fauna. The Neogene period, between 23.0 to 2.6 million years ago saw such a period. 58 million years ago, Titanoboa became extinct, so it took 25 million years to get to a point where diverse creatures and plants became abundant, due to the right conditions. That's a very long time. Eventually the brutal survival instinct that either killed competitors or kept their tummy full, got to a point where creatures could be a bit more picky, more select in the dining experience. It's having the abundance and diverse sources that enabled creatures, and eventually people, to come into being. I'm not an expert in this field, so if you want to research the how and why, please do. Suffice to say though, that this evolutionary change brought abundance and a truly diverse range of flora and fauna. Then after hominids emerged, ice ages caused similar issues, leading to species seeking new food sources or extinction. Geological events such as volcanic eruptions and earthquakes also impacted times of abundance, as well as meteorological events, such as tornadoes, rain, typhoons, sandstorms, etc. One of the weirdest things I had to get my head around was the geological layers in the earth, as seen in the strata of mountains and cliffs. It feels strange looking up to a height and discovering that the top layers were once under the ocean somewhere. Due to tectonic activity, our land and geography has changed significantly, just as much as the types of species that have existed. For example, over the large mass of northern, Central America, the ground was significantly higher than anywhere else nearby, with plate activity pushing and pulling the land beneath, succumbing to earthquakes. Volcanic activity and being carved out by huge rivers that once meandered across the continent. These rivers were hundreds of meters wide, and shaped places like the region above the Grand Canyon and in the Mississippi region. Interestingly, something I only noticed recently, is that the Grand Canyon is not just the valley you look into from the national park, but its highest point is several stories above the lookout point tourists view the canyon from. It kinda proved the point I'm making, that these vast rivers that eventually shaped and carved the landscapes, traveled over the continent whilst tectonic activity happened, as well as the waters within containing those huge creatures I spoke of earlier. So the space to thrive had also changed, not just the atmosphere. A combination of geological and atmospheric events eventually led to smaller life with greater diversity and abundance. To many it may seem obvious, but not everyone thinks about these things. However, an argument has arisen suggesting that abundance brings about complacency. It's great to see large, carnivorous creatures being more selective in their prey, but I think that this is a very good point. In scripture, there are plenty of references to places or lands of abundance, whether in the next life or the present. References to a land of milk and honey are metaphors for this profuse term. In the majority of circumstances, but not all, the challenge faced by various tribes or a nation, such as war, led to living in the land of plenty. When this happened, time was spent on fortifying the area and higher ground was coveted as it had a higher degree of natural security. The reinforcements made were to guard against such complacency and random attacks, which occur when the plenty of others is diminishing. The earliest human battles were over territory and resources, land that was fertile or had been already harvested. After all, if someone has done the work for you, why not plunder it? A civilized society brought its own problems as they emerged and formed villages and cities. The abundance in stores replaced traveling for resources, so the need for supplies, when droughts or famine occurred, became a requirement. Abundance here brings its own problems. The issues of abundance before civilization were addressed differently, using discernment and wisdom, according to the observations made. Between hunter-gathering and civilization, there was a period of abundance that enabled nature itself to help level the playing field. Before any laws there were codes, so to speak, and these appear in the transition. In large communities, especially in forest areas, they decided on a very pragmatic approach to hunting. It went along the lines of something like this: don't hunt the females or young, and if the groups thin out, allow them to thrive. The same principle could be employed for plants and vegetables as well. Why? It's a practical and simple reason, that young grow to become parents, and to enable the young to grow, as they need a mother. The females weren't hunted often, yet males were. Getting the balance right took time and was carefully observed, for we get a notion of this principle from Native American Indians. Their history and ways are very similar, and they knew that buffalo management should be balanced. The modern Americans knew this, so pretty much killed all the buffalo, in an attempt to thwart native Indian growth and culture. It was actually pretty abhorrent what the relatively new Americans did, utterly atrocious. It was a type of ethnic cleansing by taking away the diet and resources. So the hunter's code was about balance and pragmatism. Other indicators of this code are seen in the Hyrcanian forest's mysterious character, Saigalas. According to the tales, this is either a spirit or shepherd, that delivers retribution to those who don't hunt properly. An assortment of things can happen to both the hunter who violated the code and or the animal hunted. This character, Saigalas, is represented in many other cultures by virtually identical descriptions, either as an entity or person. In South American countries, this being or code is frequently used as a guide to have a good hunt. The motif occurs nearly everywhere, due to the times of abundance, basically as it keeps the balance right. When it came to survival, anything was practiced, hunting included, but out of the confines of the code. In a time of famine in South America, one kingdom did go to extraordinary extents to appease the fertility gods and, although a lot later in history, it shows the deplorable lengths some will go to regain abundance. If the culture had reverted back to hunter-gathering, the need for sacrifice to appease the gods would not have been necessary. In other anecdotal evidence, we also read of biblical stories where famine happened and how they negotiated for grain and other goods, due to some kingdoms having an abundance to survive times of hardship, Joseph's account being the most obvious. So the difference between abundance and survival is clearly evident in how it shapes our discernment. The traditional ways to inevitably provide through egalitarianism and ecological management, which encourages growth, yet can only get to this state when we don't store things up. Civilization has a lot to answer for, as it does the opposite. In relation to the first wars, I did want to mention that these were absolutely brutal. The weapons used back then, before farming, weren't as effective. Curiously, it was farming that helped develop weaponry, but that's another article altogether. Before agrarian society, battles and wars did occur, yet the majority are unheard of, unless mentioned in later texts as myths and legends. There's one war in particular that intrigues me, where almost an entire tribe, possibly a species of hominid, were completely annihilated and the land burnt to cinders, to remove any trace of it happening. This was commonplace, apparently. Such events as the Nataruk massacre, Hambledon Hill and Talheim death pit record similar practices, but the concept of war was shocking in comparison to what we understand these days. The war is mentioned is from around 13,000 years ago and no one truly knows who killed whom or why, yet the evidence points to total destruction of the tribes, even burning the bones. It occurred somewhere in northern India, but predates anything in the Mahabharata, which purports to explain a war of 13 factions in ancient India. Another example is the degree Asoka went to as ruler of his kingdom, before his conversion to Buddhism. He was really quite bloody. The point I am making is that it's the abundance within civilized society that breeds war. In survival mode, anything goes, being equally as brutal, so the norm was always an egalitarian code of hunter-gatherers, who knew how to manage the environment carefully without the need for greed. Abundance or fortification, the three modes of living are reflected in communities which they live in. In the transition between hunter-gathering and civilization, the forests were the key place to live. It was in forests and jungles that people thrived. As the first wanderers began to move, they flowed with nature, yet there came a time when the idea of care for the elderly and young was addressed, which led to village life. They continued to travel, gather and hunt, but the mothers, children and elderly stayed in the villages. This evolved into eventual farming and society, whilst hunter-gatherers also continued their way of life in parallel. There was a dichotomy, those who wanted to stay and not move, and the hunter-gatherers. So it was our ability to care that changed our way of living. Of course, the obvious thing happened, making sure there was enough to supply food for all in the settlements, leading to farming and eventually fortified ranches, leading to towns and cities. Eventually, the civilized people tried to tame the hunters-gatherers, literally, but it didn't work, for the hunter-gatherers took food freely, not storing it up. The two ways conflicted, and this is why wars began. Like I said earlier, civilization has a lot to answer for. I'm not saying that the hunter-gatherers were more peaceful, as this isn't the case, especially when they faced survival. In a situation between animal and hunter, you need to keep yourself safe. If a dodgy-looking wanderer liked your hunting gear, he may covet it and try to take it by killing you. These are just two instances of why they knew how to handle themselves. Yet they had an unwritten code they lived by. No young, no mothers, not too much. One of the clearest instances of how this all changed is seen in Genesis when it mentions the Nephilim. As I've explained before, they were a product of sons of Adam and daughters of Cain. When the hunter-gatherers started mating with civilized people, their strength and size was formidable. Why? Because civilized society requires building, construction and labor. Hunter-gatherers exercised all the time, but civilized people were stronger because of what they were doing, or building. I hope this explains how the psychology of survival and abundance within nature works now. It sounds simple, but no one really thinks of it. Every time I think of it, I just want to run off to the forest and live simply, but as I'm classed as civilized, I would actually go into survival mode rather than one of abundance. Now that's something to think about when we consider our own human nature.